And the number of tweets also featuring hashtag Dalit Lives Matter indicate that the hashtag has been actually more successful in attracting attention than the handle and the username on other social media. And importantly, my manual research on the life of hashtag Dalit Lives Matter during the first 2 years was made possible by sporadic user activity. Rather than facing sort of thousands or millions of tweets, I've kind of encountered very little, okay? And as I was going along, I screenshotted text, images that marked some, critical events, especially related to caste violence, mainly in India. So some of these I put on the slides. These are people on the right-hand side coming back from a protest following a very famous public flogging of Dalits in Western India by Hindu right outfits who accused a group of Dalits of cow slaughter. So there were protests after this, and you can see how these images and hashtag have been used with images from the civil rights movement in the US. So for example, here you have on the right-hand side the Watts riots in 1965. Then the hashtag is also used to, comment on daily reports on atrocities, against Dalits. As you can see, some pretty horrendous instances here on the slides. And it was also used following the suicide of a Dalit student, Rohit Vemula, in 2016 under the unbearable weight of caste society that also led to many protests and really became a landmark, in the recent history within Dalit communities, but not only. Here you can also see another citation, this is Martin Luther King with the portrait of Gandhi and the hashtag Dalit Lives Matter being used. But then, in 2018, there was a turning point. So I began to train in the digital humanities, and with the help of a web developer at Ulrich Karstoff at Aarhus University, my previous institution, whom I thank here. So we started to work together, and we began to harvest data systematically through the DMI Twitter capturing and analysis toolset created by the Media Studies Department, right, at the University of Amsterdam in 2014. Actually, I didn't know it was created by Yuval at that time. Okay, I was just so happy to have, to be able to use that software. So switching from a manual to a software-led research and analysis was crucial. But while I gained quantitatively, I lost qualitatively because, you can harvest images, for example, through DMI. But I was actually able to produce what the software produced other images, that is, data visualization, right? And also to shed light on very important trends that I wouldn't be able to, become aware if I continue to harvest data manually. And I really also come to appreciate the difference between the two research modalities. It's very different, but also very complementary, I would say. Now, sorry, it's probably quite small, but so overall, the body of data about hashtag Dalit Lives Matter users harvested through DMI included 49,000 tweets by 27,000 distinct users. The data count stops by July 2020, okay? And little I knew when I began to use DMI that the brutal murder of yet another African-American person in 2020 would be a turning point for global politics, both offline and online, but also that it would dramatically alter the results of my research. So the visualizations of the number of tweets featuring the hashtag Dalit Lives Matter harvested through DMI show that this hashtag remained almost dormant throughout its life until the long 2020. And to my utter surprise, 6 years after its creation, I found that hashtag Dalit Lives Matters significant rise in numbers in 2020 had been triggered by George Floyd's brutal murder. And so you see those peaks, right? That's exactly what happened. With a mere 6,700 tweets by just over 2,000 distinct users were recorded during the period of 2014 to 2019. So we have really basically, let's see, this is the one, yeah. We have 42,000 tweets during the first 7 months of 2020 alone by an overall 25,000 distinct users. So these numbers are still kind of small if compared to, you know, to the very big data, right? But still, you know, they are of, I think, quite significant. What reinforced Floyd as a catalyst for hashtag Dalit Lives Matter were the result of harvesting the combined use of Black Lives Matter, hashtag Black Lives Matter, and hashtag Dalit Lives Matter. So this constituted kind of a small pool of tweets, just below 4,000. But the intersection of the two only really gained relevance after Floyd is killed on 25th May 2020. But very importantly for our conversation, this also means that the life of hashtag Dalit Lives Matter on Twitter has not been deeply shaped by one of the countless episodes of brutal violence against Dalits in India, but by the murder of George Floyd in another continent. This reflects a much broader phenomenon, and scholar Valerie Wirtschafter has found, and these are her words, that in the years since Floyd's murder, online interest in Black Lives Matter has steadily grown, and an analysis of more than 50 million Twitter posts between 2013 and 2021 finds that the outpouring of online support for Black Lives Matter following Floyd's killing resulted in a lasting shift and more vocal and more engaged online public. Unquote. And if she says, again, her words, that Floyd's murder marked a turning point in Twitter conversations around hashtag Black Lives Matter, it also made hashtag Dalit Lives Matter finally trend. But what else can be said about this? Also keeping in mind the kind of small pool of Twitter users in India were far from being representative of the very large Dalit population in the country. In its really fine study of public killing and political assassination in South Asia, Middleton argues that to understand this phenomenon, we need to go beyond the notion of necros, or biological death. As the death of a biological body is not enough to this end, he invokes the notion of thanatos in a very particular way, that is, in his words, death and killing in their most meaningful, dynamic, and lively forms. Thanatos really unsettles, this again, I'm quoting from him, the distinctions between life and death, okay? For Middletown, assassinations and public killings are mediatic events, spectacle. And it's particularly important in this age of circulation of images of violent death across a range of media, that he says how these media, again, quote, have enabled the bare act of homicide, necros, to frequently be of but secondary importance to the high-resolution imagery of the killing themselves, unquote. So Middletown actually asks, how do we live through these public killings that take place not only in South Asia, that is focus of interest, but also in European and US cities and other locales, including Ferguson. He did mention Ferguson. In India and in other parts of the world, actually, public killings are what the polity is constituted by, tragically enough. Yet, he points out, quote, that there is an important difference between a public killing that becomes political and an assassination. Acts of terror elevate death to the realm of the political, but assassinations transform political life into political death. The former might happen to ordinary citizens, the public killing, whose deaths subsequently become politicized in a particular way. Assassinations, by the way, are reserved for victims of certain distinction. They are political through and through, unquote. So he writes this in 2018, just 2 years prior this turning point in the history of violence against African American populations, the public killing of an ordinary citizen, Floyd, that has produced unimaginable effects in the US and around the world, and for Black Lives Matter as well. However, my inquiry here brings together the form of killing, public killing, with the bodies, physical and symbolic, of the person who is killed. Why does, and this is the $1 billion question that we might ask of many other populations, of course, why does the public killing of Dalits, with or without images, and the extreme violence against them receive little or no attention outside Dalit circles and never become global? Moreover, the brutal violence and death against Dalits does not end in death, because the fight for justice that starts and very often ends unsuccessfully because of the extremely low conviction rates, prolongs basically the effects of death and violence. So what else is needed to make sense of this? So unraveling the relation between data and social justice might offer some answers. In order to address this relation, I first need to return to my manual search and analysis of hashtag Dalit Lives Matter. The politics of visual citation that I found, for example, to lynching in the US, establishes affinities, whereby the Dalit cause is anchored to that of the African American one. However, the severity of the brutal violence and atrocities against Dalit in the contemporary era truly speak for themselves, and often there's actually no equivalent for them in contemporary and past US societies. So the violence temporalities in the two continents are often out of sync. In a media piece entitled "The New 140-Character War on India's Caste System," Dalit spokesman Chandrabhan Prasad argued that, and I quote from him, "For upper caste people, Twitter is just another intervention. For Dalits, it has the potential for a revolution. There is no barrier for Dalits' entry here. Nobody will filter your words here or chop your thumb for daring to write what you feel." Indeed, there is a critical mass at this point of English-speaking and digitally savvy young Dalit activists, artists, and other cultural producers. However, Prasad is not considering those who, across the spectrum, actually, of caste and religious community, have been arrested or worse, only because of a post on social media. And what complicates the picture here, again, is that the study of hashtag Dalit Lives Matter suggests a more heterogeneous pool of users and interlocutors who might not be necessarily Dalits, but they just come together through an hashtag. That's what hashtags actually do. And we might never find out who the real hashtag Dalit Lives Matter users actually are. Okay, so if the harvest of hashtag Dalit Lives Matter does not feature caste identities, other important categories such as gender, age, religion, all of these basically remain a mystery, in the end. One can only guess the user's identities and cannot really be evinced with any, with any or no certainty. This is also a human, non-human side of interaction, because we also need to consider the presence of the bot interlocutor, okay, that is included in the final computation, for the purpose of data visualization, for example. So this inclusion and the user's socially flat nature complicate the task of provincializing, particularizing digital media's role, as advocated by Gabriella Coleman, because the social worlds that we construct out of an internet data harvest do not contain some of the most basic categories that anthropologists actually need to read in order to construct these worlds. And bots are also part of them. So the task of grasping what Bonilla and Rosas define as the complexity of who is on Twitter, as well as how people are on Twitter in different ways, gets even harder. Moreover, the scholars have pointed out, drawing from Breyer's work, that there's a very high percentage of African Americans who use Twitter in the US, if compared to white Americans. So thinking at least of the black population in the US, there is 40 million of non-Hispanic blacks at this point. This is a very interesting piece. And the scholar that I mentioned earlier, Valeria Wirtschafter, has argued that, and these are her words, the hashtag Black Lives Matter hashtag has emerged as an enduring feature of online discourse. As of April 2021, he has been using more than 25 million original Twitter posts, which collectively gathered some 444 billion likes, retweets, comments, or quotes, unquote. So this also complicates the argument of Bonilla and Rosa that have suggested that we pair the tweets with users to get a deeper sense of context. But again, this would only result in some very unstable insights because we don't have those categories. And this kind of uncertainty, so we don't know much about race, caste, gender, and religion, can produce at least two effects. First, a heightened focus on context, disembedded from users. And second, the creation of a more fluid, research sort of relation of a kind that is almost never happen, never happens during fieldwork in a physical or other digital sites. So a lot of power relations are reshuffled, and of course these still remain prominent in our research, as well as all the ethical questions about sort of showing tweets, who's produced what, who said what, because all of this is actually traceable, okay, and hence the blackening of the erasing of the the identities here. Okay. For anthropologists at least, but I'm sure also media scholars, the data harvest offers novel research possibilities. So this is what the harvest looks like, it comes on Excel sheets. And I was getting increasingly intimate with them. I began to have the feeling of getting to know these people. So, and this kind of scrolling down of Excel, more and more resembling a fieldwork modality, and a task that, in a way, was slightly less difficult because, again, of my familiarity with personal names, my knowledge of Hindi, some topographies, and other cultural references, though there are other Indian languages included here, not just Hindi, of course, but also, knowledge of India, related current affairs. We also identified, or actually the web developer identified the most 10 active hashtag Dalit Lives Matter users, and we made sure that these were human beings and not bots. But then, basically, out of these 10, 5 had their accounts either deleted or suspended, okay? So I build on Heidi Geismer's argument on the archival logic in social media platform, that to argue that this logic is actually subject to be subverted by users' deletion or self or other censorship in ways that might be very different from what takes place in other archival formations where data cannot be easily edited out. And obviously, this is the corporate status and ontology of this data in a repository where users' items are interspersed with sponsored content that should make us reflect on the nature of this data. And we usually have slightly more control, I think, in other archives. I don't think, I've done quite a lot of archival research. I don't think that I would just, it would just easier to, tear pages from books and other sorts of, other sources. Place is another coordinate that another of the coordinates that is most destabilized in the then Twitter ethnography. So this is a chart showing the localization on Twitter users using hashtag Dalit Lives Matter. So it shows that they are based in India. So this data visualization based on a standardized list of locations show how the hashtag users claim geographically, okay, to be residing in a particular country. However, when it comes to the place of origin of tweets featuring hashtag Dalit Lives Matter, there is no record of longitude or latitude for users in DMI. So from the data harvest, it emerges that 2/3 of the users mention a location in their Twitter handles. However, this cannot be taken as geolocation. And, you know, there's plenty of fantasy names in these descriptions too. But the whole thing appears, you know, that the users are predominantly basically tweeting from India, but there's no, you know, 100% sort of certainty. And importantly, for our conversation and for the story of exchanges between caste and race thinkers and activists between India and the US, the use of hashtag Dalit Lives Matter by US-based users is actually minimal. And from what I could observe so far from a number of tweets, these users appear to be of Indian origin. So as long as hashtag Dalit Lives Matter is concerned, African Americans and other citizens in the US do not feature really in, you know, in this conversation. And I come to my concluding remarks. So this Digital Humanities Project Insights challenge understandings of global solidarities and the cross-fertilization of struggles because the direction of flaws of ideas, activism, techniques, and strategies, and the kind of alliance that generate through the reformulation of, you know, hashtag Dalit Lives Matter into, hashtag Black Lives Matter into Dalit Lives Matter are rather unidirectional. I was not the only one to notice this. You know, there were some people actually tweeting about it, you know. Why, you know, will Dalit Lives Matter have a trend on Twitter? You know, so I've encountered tweets along these lines. Bonilla and Rosa argue that when people tweeted hashtag Ferguson millions of times, they managed to attract global attention to a remote location in the US. If these scholars have powerfully shown how Ferguson became the globally known hashtag Ferguson, not all remote locations are the same or equal. By following hashtag Dalit Lives Matter, indexing the trail of death and violence that engulf Dalit communities in India, this rescaling simply has not occurred. But I'm not excluding that this might have occurred if you study other hashtags, okay? Thus, this, you know, Bonilla's and Rosa's argument, and I quote from them, that Twitter allows users who are territorially displaced to feel like they are united across space and time is very much contingent on the event and hashtag's origins. However, for violence happening against Dalits, this unity hardly trespasses national borders, if at all. In addition to these asymmetries, the analysis of hashtag Dalit Lives Matter as site suggests how Dalit lives are mediated and understood via Black lives, raising further question on the complex nexus between caste and race ontologies, oppressed populations, and solidarities. On the other hand, hashtag Dalit Lives Matter users show distinct ways of speaking and creating narratives, speaking about and creating narratives about caste violence, hence challenging both the universality and uniformity of human experience in the digital sphere, and these were Coleman's, you know, words. And also, they challenge data universalism, the concept coined by Stefania Milan and Trere. On the other hand, data visualization of the use of hashtag Dalit Lives Matter, largely emanating from South Asia, reveals the use of racial violence in the US to make sense of caste crimes in India. In other words, data visualization shows the hashtag Dalit Lives Matter as a phenomenon unable to thrive independently from the Black Lives Matter movement. Thus, we might conclude that the very act of being vocal about violence against Dalits and invoking social justice from the Global South might also paradoxically further geopolitical and other inequalities. And I will stop here. Thank you very much. And also, let's hope for a ceasefire as soon as possible for Gaza. Thank you so much. And I look forward to my colleagues' comments. Thank you.
Okay, so that was the perspective from social and cultural anthropology of the Global South that Manuela just gave. From her own research, of course. Let me now call to the stage Stefania Milan. She's a professor of critical data studies at the University of Amsterdam's Department of Media Studies. And she works on the interplay between technology and society and the possibilities of self-organization, emancipation, and autonomy of their digital infrastructure. Hi, Stefania. And this is just to introduce the speakers, right? So Louisa Steur, please join us too. She's associate professor at the Department of Anthropology of the University of Amsterdam and lead editor of the Vocaal Journal of Global and Historical Anthropology. Her research focuses on changing forms of political identification and the politicization of inherited inequalities in the post-socialist context of Kerala and Cuba. Welcome. And last but not least, Payal Arora. She's a digital anthropologist, TEDx speaker, and author of award-winning books, including The Next Billion Users. Her areas of expertise include global digital cultures, inequality, cross-cultural AI ethics, and development of inclusive designs. Thank you for being here, Payal. The word is over to you.
Thank you so much for the introductions. And I'm just going to be sort of moderating this a bit so as to steer us in a more productive pathway. And we've already had that with Manuela's introductory remarks. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to have Louisa and Stefania and myself discuss some of the ideas that have been introduced and obviously connected with our work. And I'm going to conclude with basically posing questions and sort of bringing it together and synthesizing it. So we're going to have a sort of a second round of discussion and open it up. And I'm hoping we can have more of a conversation here since it's a more intimate group. So let's try to get more space for that, right? So, all right, Louisa, please.
Is it on? Yeah. Yep. I thought I'd pick up on two things in your paper, a paper that I like very much, by the way. One, context, and the other about global inequalities. I was just thinking about context in relation to Dalit Black activist connections. And we know that there's a history to these connections. In the 1940s, you had the conversation between Ambedkar and Du Bois. In the early 1970s, you, of course, had very significantly the Dalit Panthers emerging in Mumbai, directly inspired by the Black Panthers. And, well, now you have Dalit Lives Matters hashtag trailing along Black Lives Matters. Thinking about the context, those early debates and connections, of course, happened in a totally different global context of, anti-imperialist struggle and new left revival, whereas the connections that are being made now are post-neoliberalism, post the structural defeat globally of the left. And I think this is a context that is kind of hostile to context. Of course, one of these things is about form, and your paper showed beautifully, how Twitter and social media, how they tend to abstract from context. But I would like to give a few thoughts to content as well. Basically, I think there's more and more analysis coming out now that one of the problems with Black Lives Matters, why it was, well, we can say to some extent defeated, was precisely that it got that its true historical context got erased. Arun Kondani, for example, in his book, beautifully shows how, what started as a grassroots movement for prison abolition against the prison industrial complex, against borders as mechanisms of racial capitalism, got hijacked by liberal media and liberal interest into something totally divorced from that context, something about prejudice. Individual, perhaps even collective prejudice, but something of the mind. Amiya Srinivas also has made that critique, how the Black Lives Matter movement, nobody knows even about its radical manifesto, and that it called for collective property, for example, rather than just some distribution, let alone that it talked only about, the problem of police prejudice against blacks. And I like Aras Haider's book, Mistaken Identity, very much here also in that he shows that our times tend to bring forth what he calls concrete abstractions, and identity is one of those things. It seems very concrete, but in fact, if it gets divorced from historical process and the context of racial capitalism, it's merely an abstraction. So these things, I think, happen to social movements like Black Lives Matter, and well, it's of course interesting to then ask if and how this is also happening to the Dalit movement. Of course, the context of India is very different. The Hindutva version of capitalism is very different, but still, I also see the attempts to reframe the issue as merely an issue of caste prejudice, and also dominant politicians, etc., trying to focus the issue on that, pretending that that is the problem and that they are free of caste prejudice, etc., and that would solve the problem. And that brings me to your point about geopolitical inequality. Of course, these activist connections that potentially could also go under Black Lives Matter, Dalit Lives Matter connections. They can also be important because, well, we see now that Black Lives Matter is learning from this. The critique against what happened to them, the liberal hijacking, is getting stronger, and that critique, back to a critique of racial capitalism, could also stimulate similar debates in India. I haven't heard the word caste capitalism yet, but something along the lines of what Anand Tamtunde is thinking about, who very much sees caste not as this ancient, religiously sanctioned thing anymore. Not fundamentally really the real problem of caste, and yet being in that sense similar to race, that it's also reproduced as one of the mechanisms of capitalism. On the other hand, the thing that I immediately thought of with your talk and your critique of how or how you show that Dalit Lives Matters hashtag basically trails the Black Lives Matters and never really becomes trending, etc., is this old piece by Bourdieu and Lacan, The Cunning of Imperialist Reason. There they talk about how race in Latin America has been too much absorbed by racial thinking and perspectives from the US, whereas race in Latin America is very different than the binary notion of race in the US. I mean, immediately in some of those tweets, precisely because they're so short, you see this, well, caste is race here. This extreme simplification, but that's not even the biggest problem. More also, indeed, the American perspectives, caste as identity in the way that it's spoken about in the US now. I was just wondering also, of course, you've looked more at the form, I guess, of the tweet than the content, but whether you see any of these issues also emerging when you look at the content of the tweets. Those would be my thoughts.
Stefanie?
Yeah, thank you very much, Manuela, Luisa, Marlene, Payal. I'm humbled to be here because I'm no anthropologist, in fact, and also I know relatively little about India. But, this conversation started while complaining about Dutch weather and Dutch food while in the beautiful corridors of Niers. So it seems kind of a natural to be here nonetheless. So what I'm going to try to do, and these are my notes, so, see what I'm going here. I see whether I can represent what I was thinking in a way that gets out of my mental chaos at the moment. So my comments are actually more on the disciplinary differences and how different disciplines ask questions. And I'm triggered by that because you went down a road which is very familiar to me, which is Twitter analysis. I have 3 points which are, however, interrelated, and relate then on the one hand to, what you evoke as digital methods, so reasoning with the medium, the online medium, that we do quite a lot here in Amsterdam, but also the fact that I am a sociologist, a different way of looking at society, and also sociology of social movements, at least that I was in origin before joining this department and being converted to digital. So my first point is about voice. And I was very intrigued to actually learn a bit more about what you anthropologists have always been fascinated by. Anthropologists and always been playing the little ethnographer here and there. But I'm very interested in the fact that you kept repeating, or you mentioned a couple of times, that there is no certainty about who is speaking. And you also mentioned the unstable insights that this type of research into tweet yields. And I am very interested into that because we, from the one that I say we, I'm just embodying, in a way, through my department, which is much, a number of people were much better positioned than me to talk about digital methods, but I'm also part of that in a way. And what we would do is to talk about digital method without asking these strange questions about context. Who cares, right? To have the certainty. And this is because we try to follow the medium. So in a way, and this is a shortcoming, right? I'm learning here. And it's also, to be very frank, I've had this question, several times in the past, but now I have an answer in a way, which is look elsewhere, look outside the department in a way. But we start from the numbers and the software, and we will say not who has spoken and ask ourselves who is behind these tweets, but we'll say that probably the number and the software has spoken. That's it. So we start and end with the medium. In part because it's all predicated on trying to understand what the medium has to say about social reality. So it's a completely different standpoint. But I guess, the conversation, as often is the case, the truth probably lies in the middle. We're not after any truth here, but it would be interesting to meet midway in terms of thinking about voice and who is speaking. Then the other question is who is listening, but I'm going to get to that later. My second point has to do with my past in social movement research, and your question about why did, the recurrent killing of Dalit people never become a global issue of concern, whereas, the death of George Floyd, so we're talking about a ordinary person, as you named them, became a matter of concern globally. And here is, in a way, if we look at classical social movement notions, the issue of repertoire, so the fact that different moments in different locations appropriate repertoire, and the repertoire is kind of stable over time, but also, scholars talk about framing resonance. So the idea is that, and that's how, that you are looking at Dalit Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter in combination. They did it before you realized that, right? That to get to the level of the global, if you want, you have to kind of almost free ride, if you want, on another issue, so that your story, which is probably far away in the periphery of the empire in a way, then gets closer to the center, say US racial politics. In a way, it's a way of establishing affinities, but then it's also, in this case, it has been in a way a sort of unidirectional resonance. So where some part of the equation, I mean, one part of the equation, the Dalit group, saw the link, and also what you referred to, Luisa, and that was in the slide, cast is race here, oversimplification, but this is how you thrive on social media, right? And in framing resonance as well. But it didn't go the other way. So it was aspirational, but it was not recognized as being part of the same struggle. Probably for saturation reasons, we don't know. I mean, like when you have enough to think about on your plate, like racial policing in the US, perhaps you don't have the capacity of looking to a place that probably, if you're in the US, looks like the periphery of the global system, whatever. And then the third point I would like to make is about who is listening, and it's actually a very sad conclusion in a way. You refer to the piece that claimed that the new 140-character war, I refer to Twitter as a very powerful means of speaking up for people who are not listened to, who simply do not exist to the eyes of others in the country. And now, apologies for the oversimplification. As I said, I'm not an expert of India, so it's just my way of making sense of reality. I was just having visited them and spoken to people. But, this has to do with the politics of representation of a Vulpi movement. As you mentioned, there is a very small population or group, subgroup that uses Twitter. But also, besides whether there's enough Twitter users to make a movement online or not, I think this case speaks once again to the fact that certain flamboyant narratives of the Twitter revolutions are probably misplaced. And we know that from the Arab Springs, right? And probably this is another case of that. There needs to be a social movement on the ground to make a movement, and clearly there is something bubbling under the surface. But for a movement to be a movement, there should also so there is this identification of us and them that does not come only from the movement itself, but also from the outside. So recognition from the others, and the others means the them, so the enemies, if you want to oversimplify once again. And this recognition often comes also in forms of pushback. Pushback on Twitter, maybe, or pushback in the real world. And, going back to the question, who is listening? In this case, it seems there were not many people listening. Either maybe Twitter, because Twitter is the wrong place to be speaking. I don't know, you can comment to that, or Payal can. But, what if instead of listening, there is ignoring, and what if your message falls into silence, is met by silence? It's not a very, very, enthusing proposition, but maybe there's something to reflect upon. Also in terms of when politics goes digital, what does it happen? And apologies for not being an expert in anything of what you're talking about here.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to make some remarks, and it's actually what's good is that it's really weaving together all three of them, their remarks on global capitalism, labor, universalisms, context. And so let me, basically, on one hand, there's a sort of a sadness or panic that, when we talk about global solidarities, particularly through the digital media, it seems like one gets subsumed into the other because there's an obvious asymmetry of power. And, in some ways, actually, I would say that what surprised, the questions you asked, I'm not asking, because I don't think that was surprising to me. For example, why did the Dalit movement, peak with the Black Lives Matter? Why wasn't it a two-way? If I'm from India and I've been, being from the global South, it's not, we piggyback on American politics. We piggyback on American media. anything American-centric. In fact, if you look at decades of statistics on news consumption, American news is consumed by Americans majority of the time. Their awareness of global, outside of the American context, global politics, phenomena, entertainment, actually anything related to non-American life is very low. And that's because of their media diet. Whereas if you go to India, Nigeria, China, actually majority of them are pegging their news to the American context because part of a larger geopolitical struggle, right? So to me, this is a small little sort of mirror of the larger trend that's been happening for enormous amounts of time, because it's all about who has the power, which means who has the attention, and with the digital and platform economy, who gets to listen and who gets to speak, as Stefania was asking, right? So I would say that's definitely one sort of underlying framework. So in some sense, I actually celebrate Dalit Lives Matter for piggybacking on Black Lives Matter, but I don't see too much meaning in it. I see it as strategic, as, you know what, if you look at the number of likes, 0 likes, 2 likes, it wasn't really getting much attention. And in fact, many movements, K-pop in Korea, Nigeria for the, NSARS, which was a police brutality, actually, many social movements tactically and strategically decided to add the Black Lives Matter. And actually, as you saw, even All Lives Matter. They just put in whatever, right? And this is very typical, right? And this is not just online. It happens when you're in India, Nigeria, trying to get the attention of the news media. And if you can sort of build resonance with something which they think is relevant because it comes with a deep colonial sort of embedding, that surely if it's pegged to the US or any kind of, or British or any kind of Western context, then it must be somehow more important and must have some more weight. And this is part of the tactics of NGOs, intermediaries. So it goes to the next question of who is speaking. I'm not sure it's a black box. In fact, there's a lot that we can talk about who these users are with a lot of confidence without even looking at doing any digital methods. I would actually look at the realities of access. Dalits in India have very little access to digital media. Also, the culture of expression mediated through public digital platforms is far lower because it's not a safe space. WhatsApp and other encrypted platforms are relatively a safer space than Twitter. So there's a lot of activity. You're not seeing it. And this is irrelevant, and it's not. This doesn't reflect the Dalit population as much as it reflects a small subset of middle-class, elite, Western-educated intermediaries in India who are well-meaning, and civic organizations like Feminist India, a number of the media, who truly want to, who've got the diet, the Western diet in them, and know that if they can peg it to the Black Lives Matter, they can get a little more attention to their cause, because talking about caste in India is fraught, and it's a tired narrative. It's boring because it's 4,000 years old. Can you tell a story again, in another version and make it interesting? I mean, caste has been outlawed. Dalits, untouchability has been, outlawed in India and elsewhere. So, in theory, by law, it doesn't exist, but in practice, every Indian practices some kind of caste in their own interpretation, which doesn't relate to racism necessarily, because they interpret it through ritual, through a piece of clothing, through diet, and it becomes an extremely complicated narrative. And so, we are having multiple starting points, so that's why it's an impossible conversation on media, right? So I find that also really interesting in that regard. So That being said, some of the questions that I think one can tease out some things in the sense, like with Manuela. I was thinking about context collapse. And context collapse has a sort of derogatory term. It's become derogatory in media studies for a long time, for the last decade or so, because it basically says, oh my God, what is digital media doing? It is actually flattening and getting rid of nuance, getting rid of the rich cultural, social histories. And my question is, so what? As an anthropologist too, I wouldn't mind once in a while getting rid of context. So and the reason being is context can come in the way of a larger politic, of reaching out because the cause is important. Because in many political contexts, there's always a trade-off. And we're constantly doing a calculated move on when should it matter, when should it not, especially when the context doesn't work for you. If you come from basically the rest of world, which is anywhere outside the US or privileged context, your context doesn't matter. And maybe that's why the digital could be more empowering, because within your locality, which is aka India, it's too, like I said, a tired narrative. So they're circumventing that and leapfrogging it onto a fresher narrative, right? And this seems to be the case with Nigeria and a lot of these other movements that piggybacked on it. So possibly teasing out that can context collapse build empathy despite, in fact, can it be a very important strategic tool for political movements in the global south, right? And, the other aspect is that what I think you bring up in your paper, which I thought was also good to remind readers that it's not a two-way engagement. We talk about digital solidarity. Hashtag movements celebrate a sort of digital global solidarity. And actually, this is a reminder that we need to look at where the flow of interaction is. And it is, as you very well pointed, it's not a two-way engagement. It's not a natural sort of kumbaya moment online. And we need to look at the directionality of it. And so there is a sort of temporal flattening for a political goal. And my question is, when does flattening work, right? Because that's also about context collapse. And can we actually make a case for it, right? The other, then shifting with, talking, building on Louisa's work on global capitalism and labor, I think it would be interesting to delve into one of the books that have made enormous amounts of headlines and attention, which is Isabel Wilkinson's Caste. How many of you have heard or read? No, yeah, kind of, yeah. So those who don't know this, Isabel Wilkinson wrote a book called Caste. She was the New York Times editor, right, for 17 years. She's won a Pulitzer. Oprah says that this is the best book of the century. And, and basically what she's doing is she's saying the racial problem is the caste problem. And she goes to India for 3 weeks, by the way, and gets a caste radar, not my words, her words, where she's able to detect people of lower caste and Dalits by their posture, actually. So, so it is very interesting. She says that I can make out who is a lower caste or Dalit by their bearing and demeanor in accordance with the universal script of caste. So she basically has a sort of confidence in 3 weeks about India, and she appropriates that context and flattens the caste to explain a social construct which arbitrarily gives value to elements like skin color, and in India, it's apparently posture. Because here's one of the fundamental differences, right? I mean, your skin color, race, you actually cannot get rid of it. It's visible and you wear it, right? You're confronted with it. With caste, you Indians all look alike. I thought that was an interesting media example of all these girls looking on social media. But how do we know? Are there any of them lower caste, Dalits? Just put a bunch of girls looking on social media. If you actually went to and looked at Dalit girls, they're probably not going to be on social media and probably don't have their own phone, because women mostly are not allowed to own their own phone in India, or they're heavily supervised by their, father, or etc. It's a much more paternalistic culture, and if you go into a lower socioeconomic realm, it's a much more difficult scenario to see them autonomously traveling from point one to another. So it's interesting about representation too, right? But yeah, the question about, in this book, which is really celebrated about bringing the two together, in actuality is about appropriating a framework to retell a relatively tired story about race through the lens of caste, but at the expense of another context. So it wasn't necessarily in terms of solidarity, according to me, right? But anyway, so there's that. And so in this entire book, there's not one mention of global capitalism. And I think that's really important. And Louisa has done a lot of work on that. And also on the labor involved, like the emotive labor, affective labor, the actual digital labor, indirect labor of working with intermediaries to be represented or not, right, and in which ways. So perhaps you could speak on that, Louisa. And also just, and a question for Stefania, more on, universalism and solidarity. I mean, so Isabel Wilkinson's recommendation of solidarity is this. She says, because in the end of her book, she says, so what next? We have deep caste, we are, and we are structured. Race is structured into our very social fabric, infrastructures. In fact, is in a very mental construct. So how do we get rid of it? And she says we need to build radical empathy, which means you need to be pro-African American, pro-woman, pro-Latino, pro-Asian, pro-Indigenous, pro-humanity in all its manifestations. And then she says that except for whites, because with their dominance already assured by the inherited, remember now she's inscribing it in, because white people are born like that, inherited and inscribed advantages of the dominant caste, in almost every sphere of life, they should listen and not speak, which would mean none of you should be speaking right now. So I'm hoping, Stefania, you can come up with perhaps another way in which we can look at solidarity, because I assume you would not agree with that, right? And you should be able to speak, and also in a sense of embodiment. And I think that also ties with Manuela's comments about it's not just a flow of data, it's a flow of bodies, about diasporas, right? People, when we look at the location of India being the one where it's situated, the tweets, we also are the biggest population in the world right now with a massive diaspora. Just India and China alone are like, well, flowing all around, and also look at, Italians apparently in the Netherlands. So, but, so it's interesting to think about diaspora and the flow of people and the embodied nature. And, they try to create a sort of universalism by talking about discrimination and caste in California, for example, where they said, let's add caste to the elements of discrimination, and it just got cut down, right? Because Hindus felt it was breaking up the solidarity. Actually, Hindus felt discriminated by saying that if we put caste, and particularly the Dalit caste, as part of a discriminatory law, thereby, if you enter that element, then Hindus will feel that they're marginalized. So it's a really difficult conversation. I'm curious, how do we speak in terms of global solidarity or universalism in a productive way? Or are we just determined to being in our own little circles, right? And with that, maybe Manuela, you would love to, I hope.
Maybe just
Yeah, thanks so much. I just want to say, like, just a really very brief things to this, enormous amount of thinking that has come my way and everybody's way. And just to maybe go back to Louisa's question of global capitalism. I mean, caste prejudice has never just been about caste prejudice. It's always been about division of labor. In whichever capitalistic system, you put it, global, local, whatever, it's always been about division of labor, reinforced by very specific roles, classes, etc. And this, of course, I mean, the circumstances of this capitalism shift over time, but there's never just that bias, the caste bias is always, obviously, structured within these kinds of economies. Stefania, I love this, asking questions from another, here the medium, asking questions from other disciplines of other perspectives. So I think that in this case you have the certainty of the numbers, because you can do, you can work around the harvest, and the uncertainty of the user. So you have to maybe, or I have to work, or we have to work like, in that space in between. But think about it, of course, it's a context is a very, it's the last thing that you want to really drop, right, as an anthropologist. But, of course, I think this is a very good, experiment, to see how far do you want to go, right? Okay, you can go. So you have to really work, in between those certainty and uncertainty. So I'm totally there. And then, for Payal, I mean, I would be kind of, the caste narratives are kind of dull and everything, I mean, I wouldn't tell this to a caste activist, but that's another story. But I think that you really emphasize this, sort of maybe enough with this context, enough with this criticality of context. Let's see what happens if we flatten out everything. Now, online, you can do it, maybe to a certain extent, given also there's a lot of hate speech. Abuse, etc. When you go on the ground, and I've studied a lot of, Dalit activists within, a political party in northern India, the Bahujan Samaj Party. Even if, at some point there was, a whole coming together of people from different castes and communities, and I did witness to that. But on the ground, basically this wouldn't work, sort of, because you are a caste body, a caste gender community sort of body, and so it's very difficult to transcend all of this, especially in politics and especially now. So I think this is a kind of a utopian kind of project, or something that can be achieved, on Twitter. Precisely, working in between the certainty of the data, the numbers, and the uncertainty of whoever, is tweeting. And I agree, these are possibly not, people living, probably these are metropolitan users, etc. But I have all of my social media flooded. And I'm so happy, with all the young generations who are super active on Instagram, of course, on Facebook, etc. So, I think that I've also witnessed to a major shift in activism from the people that I was working with, 25 years ago to those that I see, now. I mean, really, and social media has been really so important, and lots of people actually do have phones, including girls. So I just wanted to, to say this. So I think that, yeah, the issue of context it's a sort of a challenge, it will remain with us, I think, as long as, we do research on these things. But I think that it's easier to do this online rather than on the ground, as far as I could sort of experience.
Very quickly, I guess, just something about the actual Dalit movement, which we haven't actually talked about, because the Dalit Lives Matter hashtag has nothing to do really with the enormous, rich historical Dalit movement, and that has been primarily about land reform. And partly about organizing or unorganized parts of the labor force. That actually raises the question, who is trying to get the global empathy here? Because I'm quite sure that many of those actual Dalit activists have not so much to gain from global empathy. Of course, one thing is that there are NGOs, global NGOs, who provide certain strategic funding for some of these programs, some of these platforms to run. But I don't even think it's them who are so much behind Dalit Lives Matter hashtags. The audience seems more probably the new generation of cosmopolitan young Dalits who indeed encounter friendships and encounter the kind of same discrimination that black students might. But that is such a tiny issue compared to the actual Dalit movements in India, right?
Yeah, and to your big million-dollar question, how do we speak of global solidarity, or how do we manage global solidarity and empathy beyond universalism? I don't even have an answer now. I mean, our call against or to move beyond data universalism was precisely to reintroduce or pay attention to context. It was to avoid oversimplification of seeing, everything that has to do with data politics. Remember, this is a few years ago. As is molded on, U.S. Silicon Valley infrastructure, similar to the critique of Twitter revolutions. So if you're all using Twitter, then we might all be thinking and doing and acting pretty much on the same manner. So yeah, it was an invitation of avoiding glossing over context. But then, connected to what you nicely said, what if we get rid of context? Because context sometimes, so all the nuances and all the, looking for difference and all the almost like the footnotes, no, to reality, comes on the way of a larger politics, where, in a way, I guess I'm also thinking about what is happening in Gaza as we speak. Probably it's, we can get to talk about context there, for example, over and over again, and there's different perspective on what constitutes context and what is history there. And as there's a nice series of teaching, very provocative teachings at the moment at the University of Amsterdam on the Gaza situation, on the Israel-Hamas war, which is actually entitled "History is Not Context." So I guess in the global anxiety, and this is global, I hope, that war pretty much all over the place in Ukraine, in Gaza, but in many other places that are not as frequently evoked and shown in the media, is happening as we speak. I guess the only answer is really, sort of low-hanging fruit, a humanistic answer, which is to remain human and to, as one of Italian activists said a few years ago, restiamo umani, no? In a way, let's go to the back, to what it means to be a human and have empathy beyond any sort of, musing of, our problems as academics in a way. And I'm sorry, this is not really an academic answer. And I take your question to heart because it's a very interesting one for which I definitely need to do a little bit of thinking. But it's more like a pragmatic answer in light of what's happening at the moment around us.
Thank you all, and I'm sorry I just threw these things because I knew they were just provocative and it would rattle you all three. But but in all seriousness, being in anthropology, I take context obviously seriously because we have to. That's the nature of. It's like sacrosanct, and the digital reminds us that maybe it's not all or nothing. There are times when people tactically want to circumvent context, want to invisibilize or appropriate other contexts. When does that happen? Why does that happen? Obviously, power is at the center of it all. We know that what happens online does not represent the lived realities and histories of entire movements, like the Dalit movement, which is very complicated. And obviously, power and power capital, it's all connected and has history often has a colonial, deeply colonial angle, which was, again, capitalistic in nature. So, but with that said, I think we should pause that, because as you can see, that these are just the beginnings of a conversation, because look, in the end of the day, we want, ideally speaking, we would love to see all of these disenfranchised movements come together and leverage on each other, because technically, a lot of marginalization, in fact, majority of the world is in some way or form marginalized, right? And so what happens when we turn the pyramid around and say, well, we are the normative, right? And systems may need to be designed for us. That's the ideal, right? So these are just means to an end where can we rethink capitalism? Can we rethink distribution, to face inequalities? And so these are just a small slice of a bigger aspiration. But with that, why don't we open it up? We have about, how many? That's very Indian of you. Head shake. Okay. We have 15 minutes. So, is there a mic there? Or, because there's one mic here, right? So, okay. Anyone?
Very shy.
We should like in a classroom say you. All right. Yes.
Question is probably very tangential to this discussion. I want to go back to Louisa's comment about the failure of the Black Lives Matter movement as being co-opted by the liberal media. That's very clear, in universities and colleges especially. But at the same time, it's more like there's also space for hope. Thinking back to my own students, who, I couldn't believe George Floyd, the entire thing happened in 2020. That was like 3 years ago, nearly 4 years ago now. It's just time flies. And then when you teach in a college, it's, you realize, it's just, nearly like a generation of students passed. 4 years is a short time, but then it's like, it's a whole turnaround among the students who teach. And the students who experienced Black Lives Matter were now working for organizations fighting for the ceasefire in Gaza. So you see that continuity among the younger generation. And it's not necessarily a failure in that regard, right? Because they learn how to organize. They learned as well to recognize the unity of the power that oppressed people, in different realms and different parts of the world. So they see that struggle against that power as a unified struggle, although that has yet to extend to the Dalit lives in India, but somehow it's slowly evolving in that regard. And for these kind of social movements, it's normally like, maybe 20, 30 years. It's not simply just 5 years. It takes a long time for this kind of, anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist movement to take shape on a global scale. So I think it's probably too early to say it's a failure. I'm probably, my optimism is always misguided. So, but I prefer to have a bit more hope. And regarding, the diaspora, a few weeks ago, I watched a debate, about basically, Indian, both citizens and permanent residents in California debating over this issue. And they interviewed somebody who is Dalit, living in California, and he recounted one scenario when he tried to rent a house in a predominantly Indian neighborhood in California. And he had this encounter with a landlord who's also Indian. And when he was asked about his name, he told his landlord his name, and that was a very clear sign, right? It's like, and he just saw, the landlord's face changed, or maybe just slight twitch, and he realized what happened. And then before he said anything, the landlord went, "Oh, it's not about caste at all, that I'm not renting the house. It's not about caste." And the Dalit man didn't say anything, but the landlord went straight to caste. And also that's a very interesting scenario. He was a worker speaking to a landlord. And there's a very clear class division over there as well. So at least in this scenario, you know, caste and class always intersect. And I would suppose that's probably not uncommon among other diasporic communities. So for the Dalit man, for him, you know, caste is always linked to class. In that sense, you know, for him, these are not two different struggles, probably. It's one and the same struggle. So maybe there's also a possibility of forging wider solidarities among diaspora communities. And I don't know whether that will feed back into India. I mean, I have very limited knowledge of Dalit lives in India, although I read on that, but as you can, right? You know, it's more like a 3-week travel to India. I can't say I know anything. So, yeah.
I just want to remark about, I thought the comment about failure is really a good point. In fact, there's a book called Failure by Arjun Appadurai, and it's very interesting because it also talks about, it's not the opposite of success. It's not like we understand, because we are so preoccupied about success that we just assume that whatever, all the studies and all our understandings of innovation and success, it's the opposite. And that's it, that's the byline. But actually it has its own etymology and history, and it's well worth studying it by itself without being pegged to success. And I thought in this regard, like, so for example, it's worth thinking, and I do agree with you, and I'm curious what Louisa would say about this, because has Black Lives Matter failed? And then one has to ask, what was the goal, right? And whose goal? It's not like there was one individual who sought out to do that. It's now become a cumulative. So if you think, what is the goal of a social movement? To build a certain consciousness? Or you can say to the other end is like the radical manifesto of redistribution, of reparations, etc. The whole thing didn't fill out. But if we look at other global movements, like it took 100 years to earn the right to a weekend. Okay, 100 years by labor movements. But every labor movement that failed, was a sedimentation, right? Was building upon the other until a certain consciousness came, until it became an unbearable impossibility not to do that, right? And same thing with apartheid, to a point, there's a tipping point where people felt it is just absolutely inhumane. So can anything really fail if our intent is in the right direction? And because can we actually just assume that that feeds into a larger human persistence for equality, freedom, because it's a very, it's intrinsically what makes us human, right? Is that we seek for these. And so I'm curious, could you even say there is a failure ever, I mean, would you reconsider that?
Well, that's precisely why I said it's a failure, because I do think we need to remember the radical beginnings. On the other hand, it would have been extremely surprising if they had actually been successful in making a dent in the prison industrial complex, or significantly reducing the border violence. That you would have to be a very powerful social movement for that. And I totally agree with what was mentioned in the audience, that there underneath that are forms of success in terms of learning from the movement and continuing that experience and that organizing. And that, of course, in fact, these are longer term processes. But I insist on failure to the extent that I think the liberal media are trying to portray all the diversity trainings and whatever that are going on as the success of the movement. And that is something I want to put a critical side note to.
Probably maybe one question, then we can just have drinks and talk, or we can just head to drinks and talk.
I like that.
Maybe a final remark or so. I mean, Manuela, Stefania.
Yeah. No, I was. Oh.
No, when everybody was mentioning failure, I was thinking, well, it would never come across, and not that this has been asked, to think that the Dalit movements in India have failed, even in the face of this, of the violence and that they face every day. It's just because they've changed the lives of so many, profoundly, so many people. And so, I don't know what is the measure of success. Maybe this is the one, maybe the awareness that these movements, because it's, historically and in the present, really, have had transformative effects on enormous masses of people. And I've really seen also really on the ground, what it really meant to be able to quote Dr. Ambedkar, the most famous Dalit leader, in every other every other sentence, right? And to be really empowered by, all of this history. So I would never, not that someone has said this, but I would never, even remotely associate this movement with failure. Again, even in the face of the caste discrimination that is ongoing, all the violence, etc. And so never in my life. And maybe this is how I want to end my, never failure, never.
Now, I think the pressure is on. Either Stefania comes up with another optimistic, and maybe she should say ditto. All right.
I think this is a great ending.